Following their brilliantly executed assault on the ad hoc German intelligence base, the SAS men did what they always like to do. They simply disappeared. They gathered up their kit and equipment, including the German vehicles they were borrowing, shook the hands of the commandos who were being left behind, and departed, running off to see what other trouble they might find. The commandos, along with the engineers that had been assigned to them, had to continue destroying the left behind German equipment, gathering up whatever intelligence sources they might find. However, there came a problem. Commandos, scouting in the surrounding countryside, reported large groups of enemy forces moving towards their positions. The enemy, it seemed, were responding to the SAS and Commando attack on the small intelligence base, and were moving now to retake the lost compound. The Commando force, now under the sole command of Naval Lieutenant Bernard Price, began to dig in around the farming compound, and prepared themselves for the impending assault. Tanks had been reported moving towards their positions too, but fortunately a 6-pounder gun towed by a truck had arrived overnight, not long after the SS men had departed. It had of course arrived too late to take part in the assault due to the truck breaking down, but it would be invaluable in defending the commando positions from enemy armour. Quite suddenly shots began to ring out. Enemy forces were probing from the northwest. The commandos defending that sector opened fire immediately. The Germans laid a quick smoke screen to try and cover their movements, and many British soldiers filed wildly into the smoke. The rest of the men could only sit and wait and cover their sectors. Lieutenant Price had deployed his men well and was confident of being able to defeat any attack by the enemy. However, the 6-pounder gun had not yet been deployed in its position, and enemy armour was already turning up to begin assaulting on the British base. Acting Corporal David Johnson, who commanded the gun, recalled, "There was a great deal of noise that started very suddenly. We were in the process of unlimbering our gun when a report of a pair of tanks were coming down the road. Well, actually it was the one tank. The other vehicle was a self-propelled gun, a Panzerjäger 1, a tank hunter basically. We hit that very quickly, knocking its crew out at very thin armour. We'd already whacked the tank, and its crew were in the process of bailing out when we fired again, making sure it was a total wreck." The two tanks were supported by a platoon of infantry moving in from the north, and together with mortar support they managed to encroach upon the British positions, knocking out one of the machine guns posted to cover that approach. A captured German 20mm gun had also been placed in this area to cover this sector, and it was only this, together with the British 3-inch mortar, that helped keep the attackers at bay, and so allow the British medics to help the wounded, whilst themselves under heavy mortar attack. Enough German soldiers, however, had managed to get into the buildings nearby, useful for cover, and the commandos covering this front of the battle were heavily pinned down. Lieutenant Price, together with his naval commandos being held in reserve, started to move. It appears that Lieutenant Price had grown weary of coming under mortar attack without knowing where it was coming from or able to do anything about it. He and his section of naval commandos now moved off to find the enemy mortar and so take it out. They knew it was coming from somewhere to the east, and so pressed out towards the fields there in order to engage the mortar. Meanwhile, during a short lull within the battle, the Royal Engineers attached to the small commando force began to frantically dig trenches within the compound of the farmyard, preparing a last-ditch redoubt. It seemed only a matter of time before the British force here was surrounded as more German forces approached from the north and the northwest. Meanwhile, to the east, Lieutenant Price's small section of naval commandos had found the enemy mortar and began to engage it. However, they were themselves very quickly pinned down by the fire of a 20mm gun firing at them through the trees. Pinned down in open ground by an enemy cannon whilst also under mortar fire, their situation had become immediately quite desperate. Meanwhile, coming down the road to the north and from the northwest, enemy armour approached. And again to the east, despite having suffered some casualties, Lieutenant Price's men had succeeded in knocking out the crew firing the mortar. However, they were caught in a deadly crossfire from enemy positions, including a German machine gun, which caught them right out in the open and casualties began to mount. Meanwhile, to the northwest of the British position, from where the first German attacks had begun, the commandos there were commanding the attention of a Panzer III together with a half-track supported by infantry. They unfortunately did not have the weaponry ready to engage those vehicles, and for now could do little but soak up the punishment from the tank and the machine guns of the half-track. The Commandos, holding the base, did not yet know it, but their commander, Lieutenant Price, had been killed. He lay with most of his section in the field to the east, gunned down by the 20mm cannon. What remained of his section were attempting to tend to the wounded, but were once again coming under the attention of a nearby German machine gun. The whole British commando force was for now without overall leadership, and the battle for them had become a corporal's battle, or at best a sergeant's battle, as the few sergeants and corporals amongst the British force effectively took command of the small groups of soldiers around them, clinging on desperately against the ever-increasing German attacks. With the British positions now under immense pressure, artillery landing all around them, tanks breaching through the perimeter, it is well assumed amongst the survivors of the force that had Lieutenant Price lived this long, he may well at this point have ordered an evacuation, a withdrawal from the area. And so it may well actually be that lack of a centralised command at this point saved the day, stopped the British from withdrawing without orders of course. Instead, the men, not receiving such orders, clung on desperately and doggedly, fighting on with everything they had, including rifle grenades to attack enemy tanks. One of the German tanks, the Panzer III coming in from the northwest, was hit by multiple high-explosive anti-tank rifle grenades fired by one of the Royal Engineers. The last of these grenade hits badly damaged the tank's turret ring, causing it to skew offline, making the turret of the tank effectively useless. It did, however, still have a bow-mounted machine gun, which it operated with deadly intent. Just as it was realised that Lieutenant Price and his section had been completely wiped out, the British also realised that they were now effectively surrounded. Another enemy Panzer III had moved around and was now south of their positions, their path of retreat. However, the Bofors gun that had been kept hidden and in reserve until this time now sprung out from its hiding place and began operating, firing against the Panzer III, hitting the tank several times and knocking out its crew. This action, together with the careful use of rifle grenades by the men that had them, may well have now turned the tide of the battle. The German armour and their mobility had been largely knocked out or rendered useless, and yet another tank was engaged by the Bofors gun, firing armour-piercing rounds into its side plate. The tank was set ablaze, and the Bofors now engaged the infantrymen around the tank that had been trying to move into the British positions with the armoured support. However, the Bofors crew were in for a shock. Somewhere off to the east, a large German gun had been brought into action, and as the Bofors began to withdraw, having now knocked out 2 enemy tanks and a number of infantrymen, a large 105mm shell landed close by, causing very little damage to the vehicle and fortunately completely missing the crew. However, this gun threatened to put a severe dent in the British morale. They were going to be blasted into oblivion from afar without being able to shoot back in return. The British commanders, however, ever resourceful, were not going to stand for that. 3 of the commandos, led by Lance Corporal Edmund Parry, now made a move towards where they thought the gun had fired from. The 3 of us charged out into the open, running towards a building, one of the outhouses of the farm. We were engaged by a German machine gun from the north, an MG-34 I believe. Poor old Phil was brought down by the gun just as he reached safety by the building, and I sprinted for it, running across the field beyond the house. I myself was quite badly wounded in fact. I caught 2 rounds to the arm and 1 to the lower leg. Somehow I kept running. I quickly tied on a couple of first field dressings and then continued heading east until at last I found the gun and began firing at the crew. They immediately began to scarper, and I tossed a grenade hoping it might catch them. I'm not sure it did any damage. Some of the German chaps now ran for me, and I lay in the long grass, firing shots at them, bringing them down one at a time. I'm not sure they knew exactly where I were, but before long there was only 1 or 2 left. One of them hit me in the shoulder with a shot, but he got up and ran for it. I saw him hiding in the trees. I snuck up and fired a shot, brought him down at last. I just so happened to have a very useful demolition charge, C4, and I thought, that'll do, that'll break this gun up. I just wanted to deny it to the enemy. Of course, they had more men out there that might come and pick up the gun again, despite its crew being dead. I tossed the C4 and watched as it destroyed the gun and many of the trees nearby. my job was done. I ran back towards the rest of the lads. But I was losing blood, I was badly hurt. However, we needed to get rid of that bloody machine gun. I laid down by the fence and began shooting at the two men manning the machine gun. I don't think they knew where I were. One of them I brought down, and then the other straight after. No more shots from that gun was fired at me that day. I was already badly wounded enough. I needed to find myself a medic. Lance Corporal Edmund Parry's decision to run across open ground, facing the machine guns as well as a whole crew manning the 105mm gun, was to earn him the Victoria Cross for his actions. This little action of his was also the last of the battle, really. The German attacks had ended. Their forces had been largely broken up. Any survivors were now withdrawing. The battle had been extremely costly for the British too. They had lost a good number of men as well as some of their equipment, and it was almost a certainty that they would have withdrawn as best they could, had Lieutenant Price been alive to give such an order. It was only now, as the dust began to settle, that the men surviving realised that by a miracle they had escaped. Between the men killed during the battle and those that would die after from their wounds, 34 of the Commandos would not reach home again. However, they killed or badly wounded an estimated 204 German soldiers and knocked out a number of tanks and half-tracks, as well as one 105mm gun. Their stand had been astonishing. Now it was time for them to pick up their equipment and withdraw towards the coast to be lifted off by the flotilla that had landed them in the first place.